March 15, 1944, over the Solomon Islands, Pacific Theater. Lieutenant Elena Hartmann gripped the controls stick of her Messerschmitt Bf 109 G6, her gloved hands trembling, not from fear, but from the impossible sight below her. Through the smoke and chaos of aerial combat, she had just witnessed something that contradicted every briefing, every intelligence report, every assumption about American aircraft capabilities. A dark blue fighter with inverted gull wings had just climbed past her at an angle that shouldn't have been possible, rolled inverted with casual ease, and dove back down with a speed that made her Gustav feel like it was standing still in the air. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The aircraft designation painted on captured intelligence photos had been dismissed by Luftwaffe Command as American exaggeration. The Chance Vought F4U Corsair, Berlin had told them it was overweight, difficult to handle, and plagued by technical problems. What Elena had just seen defied every word of that assessment. The Corsair had accelerated away from her dive like a falcon striking prey, its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine propelling it through the air with a power that seemed to mock the laws of physics she had learned at the Berlin Technical University before the war. Elena's squadron had launched that morning with confidence born of experience. They were veterans of the Eastern Front, transferred to the Pacific after proving themselves against Soviet aircraft over the frozen steppes of Russia. Their Messerschmitt fighters had dominated the skies from Poland to the outskirts of Moscow. They carried with them the arrogance of pilots who believed German engineering was supreme, that Teutonic precision and discipline would prevail against American mass production and sloppy manufacturing standards. That confidence had lasted exactly 11 minutes into their first encounter with Corsair squadrons operating from Henderson Field on Guadalcanal. The morning briefing at Rabaul had been routine. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, their squadron commander, had reviewed the intelligence reports with his usual Prussian efficiency. The Americans were flying a new fighter, yes, but it was plagued with problems. The report stated clearly that the long nose obstructed forward visibility during carrier landings, that the cockpit was positioned too far back for proper combat effectiveness, that the aircraft was so difficult to handle that the U.S. Navy had initially rejected it for carrier operations. These were facts, delivered by intelligence officers who had never seen the aircraft in combat, typed on official documents stamped with eagles and swastikas, filed in folders that smelled of certainty and institutional authority. Elena had listened to the briefing while checking her flight gear with the methodical precision that had kept her alive through 47 combat missions. At 23 years old, she was one of only 12 women who had somehow convinced the Luftwaffe to let them fly combat missions, though officially she was listed as a test pilot transferred to operational evaluation duties. The technicality didn't matter when bullets were flying. Her Iron Cross second class, earned over Kursk, was real enough. Her 5 confirmed kills were documented in the squadron logs. The respect of her fellow pilots had been won through skill demonstrated in the unforgiving arena of aerial combat, where gender meant nothing and ability meant everything. The flight to the intercept point had been smooth. 6 Messerschmitt fighters flying in tight formation, their engines running with the precision that German manufacturing was famous for. Below them, the Pacific Ocean stretched in endless blue, broken only by islands that appeared as green jewels scattered across an azure canvas. Elena had flown over many landscapes in her career. The industrial cities of the Ruhr, the wheat fields of Ukraine, the frozen forests of Russia, but nothing compared to the surreal beauty of the Pacific. It was almost possible to forget for a moment that this paradise was soaked in blood, that beneath those beautiful waves lay thousands of dead sailors and shattered ships. The American formation had appeared exactly where intelligence said it would be. 8 aircraft flying combat air patrol over a convoy of transport ships. From a distance, they looked ungainly, those distinctive inverted gull wings giving them an appearance that seemed almost comical compared to the clean lines of German fighters. Elena had smiled inside her oxygen mask, thinking how easy this would be. The Americans were known for their lack of discipline, their casual approach to military formality, their tendency to rely on numbers rather than skill. 6 elite German pilots against 8 American flyboys who had probably learned to fly 6 months ago on crop dusters in Nebraska or wheat fields in Kansas. The mathematics seemed favorable. Hauptmann Weber had led them into the attack with textbook precision. Diving from the sun, altitude advantage secured, formation tight, radio discipline perfect. Everything by the book, everything as it had worked hundreds of times before against Soviet Yaks and British Spitfires. Elena had selected her target, a Corsair flying slightly separated from the main formation, and begun her attack run. The range closed rapidly. Her finger moved to the trigger of her 20mm cannons, her training taking over, the mechanical calculations of deflection angle and lead time happening automatically after so many missions. Then everything she knew about aerial combat became irrelevant. The Corsair didn't evade in the conventional sense. It didn't brake left or right, didn't dive away or attempt a climbing turn. Instead, it simply accelerated. The massive propeller bit into the air. The engine note changed from a rumble to a roar, even audible over Elena's own engine, and the American aircraft pulled away from her attack as if she were flying a trainer aircraft. The speed was impossible. Her Messerschmitt was already at maximum velocity in the dive, yet the Corsair increased the distance between them as easily as a sports car pulling away from a bicycle. Elena had yanked her stick back, trying to follow, and that's when she learned the second lesson about the Corsair. It didn't just accelerate horizontally, it climbed. The American pilot pulled the nose up at an angle that should have stalled any conventional fighter, but the Corsair simply clawed its way toward the sky as if gravity were a suggestion rather than a law. Elena's Messerschmitt, stressed to its limits, began to shudder as it approached stall speed. The stick shook in her hands, the warning signs of impending loss of lift that every pilot learned to fear. She had no choice but to push the nose down, to trade altitude for airspeed, to abandon the attack.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Above her, the Corsair had rolled inverted with a smoothness that seemed almost lazy, hung in the sky for a moment like a hawk surveying prey, then dove back down with its engine screaming. Elena had barely registered the movement before tracers were streaking past her canopy, the distinctive sound of 50 caliber bullets cutting through air that had been empty a second before. 6 machine guns, she would later learn, each one firing 850 rounds per minute. The Corsair didn't just outfly German fighters, it outgunned them too. She had thrown her Messerschmitt into a desperate defensive spiral, every evasive maneuver she knew, every trick learned from combat with the best Soviet pilots. The Corsair stayed with her through every turn. Not struggling, not fighting the controls, just flying with a confidence that suggested its pilot was barely working. When Elena tried to reverse the turn, hoping to catch the American overshooting, the Corsair simply used its superior power to climb away, reset the engagement, and dove back down from a position of advantage. It was like fighting an opponent who could see the future, who knew what she would do before she did it, who had an answer to every question she posed. The entire squadron was in trouble. Elena could hear the panicked German voices on the radio, the professional calm of the morning briefing replaced by the sharp urgency of pilots who had suddenly discovered they were outmatched. Hauptmann Weber was shouting instructions, trying to reform the formation, attempting to use teamwork and discipline to overcome the American advantage in aircraft performance. But the Corsairs weren't cooperating with German tactics. They fought in pairs, covering each other, using their speed to control the engagement distance, using their climb rate to maintain energy advantage, using their firepower to make every attack decisive. Lieutenant Franz Mueller's Messerschmitt was the first to go down. Elena saw the smoke trail, heard his brief cry over the radio, watched as his aircraft spun toward the ocean with one wing shredded by 50 caliber fire. Franz had survived 2 years on the Eastern Front, had painted 16 kill marks on his fuselage, had been recommended for the Knight's Cross. It had taken a Corsair pilot perhaps 30 seconds to shoot him down. The mathematics of aerial combat had shifted, and the formula that had worked over Russia and Africa no longer applied to the Pacific. Elena had managed to escape by diving toward the wave tops, using the Messerschmitt's excellent low-altitude maneuverability to stay ahead of the pursuing Corsair. The American pilot had followed her down, patient and methodical, waiting for a mistake. At 50 feet above the ocean, with spray from the wave tops occasionally hitting her windscreen, Elena had pushed her aircraft to its absolute limits. The engine temperature gauge was in the red zone, the airframe was protesting with creaks and groans, her arms ached from fighting the control stick. Still, the Corsair stayed behind her, not even breathing hard, its pilot probably drinking coffee and listening to jazz music for all the strain he was showing. Only a lucky cloud bank had saved her. Elena had pulled into the mist with her aircraft shaking from the high-speed stress, emerged on the other side, and used every bit of fuel conservation technique she knew to limp back to Rabaul.
Behind her, she left 2 squadron mates dead, one aircraft so damaged it would never fly again, and the shattered certainty that German engineering was superior. The Corsair hadn't just defeated them, it had made them look like amateurs, like student pilots facing an instructor, like children playing at war against professional soldiers. The landing at Rabaul had been quiet. No victory rolls, no celebrations, no proud taxi to the dispersal area. The surviving pilots had climbed out of their aircraft in silence, each one processing what they had experienced, each one knowing that something fundamental had changed. The mechanics had gathered around the damaged fighters, counting bullet holes, examining stress damage, shaking their heads at the evidence of combat with an aircraft that should not have been able to do what it obviously had done. Elena had walked to the debriefing room with legs that felt disconnected from her body, adrenaline shock making everything seem slightly unreal. The room smelled of stale coffee, cigarette smoke, and fear masked as professional calm. The intelligence officer who had delivered the morning briefing was there, clipboard ready, prepared to record their observations about the enemy aircraft that intelligence had assured them was problematic and inferior. He had looked at the survivors' faces and put down his clipboard without asking a single question. Some truths didn't need to be spoken aloud. Hauptmann Weber had finally broken the silence. "Forget everything we were told about American aircraft," he had said, his voice flat with the tone of a man who had just had his worldview demolished. "The Corsair is faster than anything we have. It climbs better than anything we have. It dives faster, turns tighter at high speed, and carries enough firepower to tear a Messerschmitt apart in a single pass. Whoever wrote our intelligence reports has never seen this aircraft in combat. Or they were lying to us. Or they are fools. Perhaps all three." The intelligence officer had started to protest, to cite reports from Berlin, to mention technical specifications that proved German aircraft were superior. Weber had silenced him with the look that could have frozen nitrogen. "2 good pilots are dead," he had said quietly. "My wingman has 73 holes in his aircraft. Lieutenant Hartmann's engine is destroyed from overstressing. We were outflown, outgunned, and outfought by aircraft that your reports claimed were inferior. You will file a report stating exactly that, or I will file a report about your competence. Choose." Elena had sat through the rest of the debriefing in a daze, her mind replaying every second of the combat, analyzing what she had seen, trying to understand what it meant. The Corsair wasn't just a good aircraft, it was a revolutionary one. Every aspect of its design seemed optimized for the brutal mathematics of aerial combat. The massive engine provided power that German designers had never achieved. The 6 machine guns delivered more firepower than any fighter she had faced. The rugged construction meant it could absorb damage that would destroy a Messerschmitt. And the performance, speed, climb rate, dive capability, exceeded anything in the Luftwaffe inventory. But the aircraft itself was only part of the story. The American pilots had flown with a confidence that came from knowing they had the superior machine. They had dictated every aspect of the engagement, choosing when to attack and when to break off, using their aircraft's advantages to create situations where German skill and training meant nothing. It was like fencing against an opponent with a longer sword, more reach, and heavier armor. No amount of technique could overcome such fundamental advantages. That night, unable to sleep in the oppressive heat of her quarters, Elena had walked to the flight line and stood looking at her damaged Messerschmitt. The aircraft had served her well, had brought her through dozens of combats, and had been maintained with the precision that German engineering was famous for. But standing there in the tropical darkness, with palm fronds rustling overhead and the distant sound of waves breaking on the reef, she understood a truth that would haunt her through every mission that followed. She was flying an excellent aircraft from 1939, maintained with parts that were increasingly difficult to obtain, burning fuel that was synthetic because Germany no longer had access to oil fields. The Americans were flying a 1944 aircraft built with unlimited resources, powered by an engine that represented the pinnacle of American industrial might, supported by a supply system that could deliver replacement parts anywhere in the Pacific within days. The technical specifications she would later see in captured documents told a story that numbers alone couldn't fully convey. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double Wasp engine produced 2,000 horsepower, more than any German aircraft engine. The Corsair could reach 446 miles per hour in level flight, making it one of the fastest fighters in the world. It could climb to 20,000 feet in 7.5 minutes, a rate that allowed it to dominate any vertical engagement. The combat radius of over 1,000 miles meant it could escort bombers deep into enemy territory and still have fuel for extended combat. The 650 caliber machine guns carried 2,400 rounds of ammunition, enough for sustained firing in multiple engagements. But beyond the specifications, beyond the numbers and technical data, lay something more profound and more disturbing. The Corsair represented American industrial capacity operating at full power. Every aspect of the aircraft spoke of a nation with unlimited resources, advanced technology, and the organizational ability to mass-produce complex machinery. The bent-wing design, initially troubling to German engineers when they first saw photographs, turned out to be a brilliant solution that allowed a shorter landing gear while maintaining propeller ground clearance. The cockpit position, supposedly a disadvantage according to German intelligence, actually provided excellent visibility in combat. Every supposed weakness turned out to be either misinformation or a misunderstanding of American design philosophy. Elena had returned to her quarters as dawn was breaking, the tropical sun rising over the Pacific with indifferent beauty. She had sat on her bunk and written a letter to her younger sister back in Hamburg, though she knew the letter would never make it through military censorship if she told the truth. Instead, she wrote about the weather, about missing home, about hoping the war would end soon. She didn't write about the Corsair, about the feeling of helplessness as a superior aircraft hunted her across the sky, about the knowledge that every future mission would be flown with the understanding that American pilots held every advantage that mattered in aerial combat. The weeks following that first encounter with the Corsair transformed Elena's understanding of aerial warfare in ways that no amount of training or briefing could have achieved. Each mission became a lesson in humility, each engagement a reminder that technological superiority could overcome even the most skilled pilots. The Luftwaffe had built its reputation on precision engineering and tactical excellence, but in the skies over the Pacific, those advantages were dissolving like morning mist under the harsh sun of American industrial might. By April 1944, the pattern had become grimly predictable. German and Japanese forces would launch interception missions against American bomber formations, only to find themselves engaged by Corsair escorts that could outperform them in every measurable category. The Marines were flying the Corsairs now, having embraced the aircraft that the Navy had initially rejected for carrier operations. Those leatherneck pilots flew with an aggressiveness that matched their reputation, using the Corsair's superior performance to press attacks that would have been suicidal in lesser aircraft. They had discovered what Elena and her squadron mates were learning the hard way. When you have the better machine, you can dictate the terms of every engagement. Elena had survived 6 more encounters with Corsairs by mid-April, though survival felt less like victory and more like temporary postponement of the inevitable. She had learned to recognize the distinctive sound of the R2800 engine, a deep, rumbling growl that was different from any other aircraft. That sound had become the auditory signature of trouble, the warning that meant pushing her Messerschmitts to its limits just to stay alive. She had learned to avoid vertical engagements at all costs, knowing that the Corsair's climb rate would turn any upward maneuver into a death sentence. She had learned to respect the 650 caliber machine guns that could tear her aircraft apart in seconds if she made even a small mistake. The losses mounted with mathematical inevitability. Lieutenant Hans Becker, who had taught Elena aerobatics back in training, was shot down on April 8th. His Messerschmitt had exploded in midair when Corsair fire hit the fuel tank, the fireball visible for miles across the clear Pacific sky. Feldwebel Maria Steiner, one of the only other female pilots in the theater, had crashed into the ocean after her engine was damaged during a running battle with 3 Corsairs. The rescue boats never found her body. Hauptmann Klaus Weber, who had led the squadron with Prussian efficiency and growing desperation, was killed on April 23rd when he attempted to ram a Corsair after running out of ammunition. The American pilot had simply accelerated away from the attack, then circled back to shoot Weber down with clinical precision. Each loss diminished not just the squadron's numbers, but also its collective will to fight. The pilots who remained were the lucky ones, the survivors who had so far avoided the fatal mistake that combat with Corsairs inevitably punished. They flew their missions with the grim determination of men and women who knew they were outmatched but had no choice except to continue. Orders came from distant headquarters, staffed by officers who had never faced a Corsair in combat, who still believed that German training and discipline could overcome American material advantages. Those orders sent them into the sky day after day, mission after mission, to face an opponent that held every card that mattered. Elena had been promoted to squadron leader by default in early
May, not because of any particular achievement, but simply because she had survived longer than anyone else. The promotion came without ceremony, just a brief notation in the duty roster, and the weight of responsibility for leading pilots into combats they were unlikely to survive. She had accepted the position without comment, knowing that refusing would accomplish nothing except passing the burden to someone else. Leadership in a defeated squadron meant writing letters to families back in Germany, letters that tried to make heroic sense of deaths that were really just the grinding mathematics of industrial warfare. The intelligence reports that reached Rabaul in May revealed the full scope of what they were facing. The Corsair wasn't a limited production aircraft or an experimental design. American factories were building them by the thousands. The Chance Vought plant in Connecticut, the Goodyear facilities in Ohio, the Brewster factory in Pennsylvania, multiple production lines churning out Corsairs at rates that seemed impossible to German minds accustomed to scarcity and resource constraints. By the time Elena read these reports, more than 4,000 Corsairs had been built, and production was accelerating. The Americans were building more Corsairs each month than the entire Luftwaffe could produce of all aircraft types combined. But the numbers alone didn't capture the true challenge. Each Corsair was maintained by a supply system that could deliver spare parts anywhere in the Pacific theater within days. When an engine needed replacement, a new R-2800 arrived on the next transport ship, fresh from the factory, tested and ready to install. When combat damage required structural repairs, the materials and tools appeared as if by magic, backed by an industrial system that treated the Pacific War as just one of many theaters requiring support. German mechanics, meanwhile, were cannibalizing damaged aircraft for parts, improvising repairs with materials that barely met specifications, stretching supply lines that ran through submarine-infested waters back to a homeland that was itself running short of everything that mattered. Elena had witnessed this disparity firsthand during a rare ground inspection of a captured Corsair that had been forced down intact after taking ground fire. The aircraft had been flown to Rabaul by a test pilot, and Elena had been invited to examine it as part of her duties as squadron leader. Walking around the Corsair on the ground, she had been struck by the sheer size of the machine. It was massive compared to her Messerschmitt. the huge propeller blades reaching nearly to her shoulder even when the aircraft was sitting level. The cowling that covered the R-2800 engine bulged with the promise of raw power, the exhaust stacks showing evidence of temperatures that would have melted lesser engines. The cockpit had been a revelation in American design philosophy. Where German aircraft emphasized efficiency and minimalism, the Corsair's cockpit was spacious, almost luxurious by comparison. The instruments were large and easy to read, arranged logically, clearly labeled in English that Elena could partially understand. The seat was comfortable, adjustable, designed for pilots who might spend hours in the air. The canopy provided excellent visibility despite intelligence reports claiming the opposite, the frameless design offering an unobstructed view that made her Messerschmitt's framework seem claustrophobic by comparison. Most striking was the sense of robust construction, the feeling that this aircraft had been built with abundant materials by workers who didn't have to compromise or economize. Every rivet was properly set, every panel fit precisely, every system showed evidence of quality control that matched or exceeded German standards. The armament had been particularly sobering. 6 Browning M2 machine guns, 3 in each wing, each one capable of firing 850 rounds per minute. The ammunition boxes held 400 rounds per gun, 2,400 rounds total, enough firepower to shred any aircraft that got in the way. Elena had done the mathematics. At maximum rate of fire, all 6 guns could deliver 5,100 rounds per minute. Even a brief burst would put dozens of 50 caliber bullets into a target. The Corsair didn't just outfly German fighters, it could destroy them with a firepower advantage that was almost obscene in its overwhelming superiority. The German test pilot who had flown the captured Corsair had delivered his report with the clinical detachment of an engineer discussing abstract specifications. The aircraft, he noted, was stable in flight, responsive to controls, forgiving of pilot errors that would have been fatal in other high-performance fighters. The engine provided smooth, reliable power throughout the operating range, with enough reserve capacity to handle combat maneuvering without risk of overstressing. The high-speed handling was excellent, with none of the control stiffening that plagued German fighters near maximum velocity. The stall characteristics were benign, giving plenty of warning before loss of lift. In summary, he concluded, the Corsair was exactly what American pilots claimed, a superior fighter aircraft that combined excellent performance with practical reliability. Elena had listened to this assessment while standing beside the captured aircraft, her hand resting on the dark blue wing, feeling the solid construction beneath the paint. She had thought about all the times she had heard German officers dismiss American equipment as inferior, as shoddily built, as the product of a mongrel nation incapable of real engineering excellence. Standing there beside the Corsair, she understood how dangerously wrong those assumptions had been. The Americans had built not just a good aircraft, but a great one, and they had built it in quantities that suggested industrial capacity beyond German comprehension. The real war, Elena had realized that day, wasn't being fought in the skies over the Pacific or in the deserts of North Africa or on the frozen steppes of Russia. The real war was being fought in the factories of Detroit and Connecticut, in the steel mills of Pennsylvania, in the aircraft plants that stretched across the American continent. Every Corsair that rolled off the production line represented not just an aircraft, but a statement of industrial dominance, a declaration that America could outbuild, outproduce, and overwhelm any opponent through sheer material superiority. German pilots might be skilled, German aircraft might be well designed, but none of that mattered when the opponent could replace losses faster than you could inflict them. The final crushing blow to Elena's illusions came in June 1944, when she encountered the Corsair's most devastating capability. During an interception mission against American bombers attacking Truk, her squadron had engaged a formation of Corsairs providing high cover. The American pilots had used a tactic that German fighters simply couldn't counter.
They had climbed to 30,000 feet, far above the effective ceiling of the Messerschmitt fighters, and dove down through the German formation with speed that made evasion impossible.
The Corsairs had struck like eagles dropping on pigeons, each one selecting a target, making a single devastating gun pass, then climbing back to altitude using the massive power of their engines. Elena had watched helplessly as 3 squadron mates were shot down in less than a minute, the Corsairs executing their attacks with choreographed precision, each pilot supporting his wingman, each engagement planned and executed with professional competence. The German fighters had been unable to respond effectively. Climbing to engage meant entering a stall condition before reaching the Corsairs' altitude, and diving away simply meant presenting an easier target. The Americans had controlled the vertical dimension of the battle space completely, using their aircraft's superior climb rate to maintain a position of invulnerability while striking at will against opponents who couldn't reach them. After that mission, Elena had returned to Rabaul with her fuel gauge reading nearly empty, her ammunition exhausted from defensive firing that had hit nothing, and the knowledge that the war in the Pacific was already lost regardless of what orders might come from Berlin. The Corsair had demonstrated that American pilots didn't need to be better than German pilots, they just needed to be competent enough to use the advantages their aircraft provided. The machine was doing half the work, carrying its pilots into combat with capabilities that transformed average flyers into deadly opponents and turned skilled pilots into aviation artists who could paint the sky with victory. The diary Elena kept in violation of security regulations contained her most honest thoughts about what she was witnessing. In an entry dated June 15th, written by flashlight in her quarters after a mission that had killed 2 more pilots, she had recorded her conclusions with the clarity of someone who had finally accepted an unwelcome truth. We are fighting with tools from yesterday against an opponent who is already built tomorrow. The Corsair is not just a better aircraft, it represents a better system, a better way of thinking about industrial warfare. The Americans don't try to build the perfect fighter. They build a very good fighter and then build thousands of them, supported by spare parts, maintenance systems, and pilot training that ensures maximum effectiveness. They have turned warfare into an industrial process, and we cannot compete with their factories any more than we can compete with their fighters. By July 1944, the situation at Rabaul had become untenable. American forces were bypassing the base, isolating it through a strategy of island hopping that rendered the garrison irrelevant without the need for a direct assault. Supply ships stopped arriving, fuel became critically scarce, and replacement aircraft were non-existent. The surviving pilots, including Elena, were evacuated to Truk, then to the Philippines, each move westward a retreat from the advancing American juggernaut. The Corsairs followed them, operating from newly captured airfields, their range extended by drop tanks that gave them the reach to strike deep into territory that should have been safe. In the Philippines, Elena flew her final combat missions against Corsairs in August 1944. By then, she was operating a worn Messerschmitt that burned oil, had patched bullet holes from 3 previous engagements, and represented the depleted state of German air power in the Pacific. The American aircraft she faced were fresh from the factory, maintained to perfection, flown by pilots who had the confidence that came from knowing they had the superior machine.
The contrast between German scarcity and American abundance had become so stark that it was almost comical, except that people were dying because of that disparity. On August 23rd, Elena's war ended not with dramatic combat, but with mechanical failure. Her engine, stressed beyond its design limits and maintained with improvised parts, seized during a routine patrol. She had managed to glide to a forced landing on a beach held by Philippine guerrillas who were cooperating with American forces. The Messerschmitt, her companion through dozens of missions, had crumpled on landing, its undercarriage collapsing, its wings buckling, its usefulness finished. Elena had climbed from the wreckage with a sprained ankle and the strange relief of knowing she would fly no more missions against aircraft she couldn't defeat. The guerrillas had turned her over to American forces within a week. She had expected harsh treatment, imprisonment, perhaps worse. Instead, she had been processed with bureaucratic efficiency, given medical care for her ankle, interviewed by intelligence officers who were more interested in technical details about German aircraft than in ideology or politics. The Americans had been professional, even courteous, treating her as a fellow pilot who had simply been on the losing side. That courtesy, that absence of hatred or revenge, had been more unsettling than cruelty would have been. In the POW camp where she spent the remainder of the war, Elena had time to reflect on everything she had witnessed. The camp itself was another lesson in American material superiority: adequate food, clean water, medical care, shelter that kept out the tropical rains. The guards were neither cruel nor particularly friendly, just men doing a job, professional soldiers who treated prisoners according to regulations rather than emotion. It was all very American. Organized, efficient, operating according to systems that worked because they were designed to work and supported with the resources necessary to make them work. Other pilots arrived at the camp throughout late 1944 and early 1945, each one bringing stories that confirmed what Elena had learned firsthand. The Corsair was dominating the Pacific skies, shooting down Japanese and German aircraft with a kill ratio that approached 10-1. American pilots were racking up ace status in weeks rather than months, not because they were necessarily more skilled, but because they were flying an aircraft that gave them every advantage that mattered in combat. The stories from Europe were similar. American P-51 Mustangs were escorting bombers to Berlin. American P-47 Thunderbolts were dominating ground attack missions. American B-29 Super Fortresses were bombing Japan from altitudes that Japanese fighters couldn't reach. Every theater, every mission type, every category of aerial warfare showed the same pattern. American aircraft backed by American industrial might were overwhelming opponents who lacked the resources to compete. The news of Germany's surrender in May 1945 reached the camp with surprising speed. Elena had felt neither grief nor relief, just a numb acceptance that the war she had known was inevitable to lose had finally ended. The atomic bombs dropped on Japan in August brought the Pacific War to its conclusion, and Elena found herself facing an uncertain future in a world that had been transformed by industrial warfare into something her pre-war self wouldn't have recognized. During the months waiting for repatriation, Elena had conversations with American pilots who visited the camp out of curiosity about their former opponents. These discussions, conducted in broken English supplemented with hand gestures and drawings, had revealed the final piece of the puzzle. The Corsair pilots spoke with casual confidence about their aircraft, describing it not as a wonder weapon, but as a good tool that did its job well. They talked about the mechanics who kept the planes flying, the supply officers who ensured parts were available, the training system that produced competent pilots by the thousands, the industrial base that could absorb losses and replace them within days. The aircraft was impressive, but the system that produced and supported it was the real weapon. One American pilot, a Marine captain named Robert Morrison, who had flown Corsairs since 1943, had shared his perspective during a conversation in September 1945. He had sat across from Elena in the camp mess hall, drinking coffee that was real rather than the ersatz substitute Germans had learned to tolerate, and explained his view of aerial combat with the straightforward honesty that Americans seemed to favor. "The Corsair is a great plane," he had said, "but any plane is only as good as the fuel in its tanks, the bullets in its guns, and the mechanic who keeps it running. We won because we had all of that, all the time, more than we needed. You guys were good pilots, probably better trained than most of us, but you were flying on fumes, shooting with limited ammo, in planes that were held together with prayers and improvisation. That's not a fight, that's just math." Elena had returned to Germany in early 1946, repatriated to a country that bore little resemblance to the nation she had left. The cities were rubble, the economy was destroyed, the population was struggling to survive amid the ruins of Hitler's ambitions. But amid the devastation, there were also signs of rebuilding, of people determined to create something better from the ashes of what had been lost. Elena had used her engineering education to find work helping to reconstruct aircraft manufacturing facilities, this time focused on civilian rather than military production.
The skills she had learned as a pilot and the lessons she had absorbed about American industrial methods proved valuable in the post-war world. In the years that followed, Elena had watched as Germany rebuilt itself with assistance from the same nation that had defeated it. The Marshall Plan brought American resources, American methods, and American ideas about industrial organization to Europe. The lessons of the Corsair, that superior systems matter more than individual excellence, that industrial capacity wins wars, that prosperity comes from efficient production, became foundational principles of the German economic miracle. The country that had lost everything discovered that it could learn from defeat and emerge stronger by adopting the methods that had beaten it. Elena never flew combat missions again, but she never forgot the lessons learned in the skies over the Pacific. The Corsair had been more than just an aircraft. It had been a messenger carrying news about how the world had changed, about how industrial might had become the ultimate arbiter of national power, about how systems and resources mattered more than courage or skill alone. Those lessons, bought with the lives of squadron mates and the humbling experience of being repeatedly outfought by superior technology, shaped her understanding of what made nations strong and what led them to defeat.
The story of the Corsair and the pilots who flew it became, for Elena, a parable about the nature of modern warfare and the importance of industrial capacity. The aircraft itself was impressive, fast, powerful, deadly in combat, but the real weapon had been the American system that produced 2,400 Corsairs, that kept them flying with spare parts and fuel, that trained pilots to use them effectively, that deployed them across the vast Pacific with logistical precision. That system, more than any individual aircraft or pilot, had won the war. Understanding that truth had been painful, but it had also been liberating. It had freed Elena from the illusions of superiority that German propaganda had promoted, and it had shown her a path toward building a better future based on reality rather than mythology. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.